Okay, so you know how we do these deep dives, right? We take all this fascinating stuff. You guys share books, articles, videos, and we really try to unearth the core, the gems.
Yeah.
And this time around, it's some pretty deep stuff.
Yeah, for sure. This one really takes you down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. So we've got this video where Sarah Procter Abbott is talking about 𝗕𝗂𝗱𝗵𝗶𝘀𝗁's teachings on Theravada Buddhism, and then we've also got this study guide that kind of lays out some of the key concepts. And I have to say, just going through this material, it's like this theme keeps popping up.
Yeah.
That if we really understand the nature of reality, like truly grasp it, it could actually be the key to like navigating all those tough parts of life, you know?
Yeah, that's definitely the central thread running through this whole thing. We've got this really amazing transcript from that YouTube video, so we're hearing directly from 𝗕𝗂𝗱𝗵𝗶𝘀𝗁 through Sarah Procter Abbott's narration. And then this study guide really helps to like clarify things, define terms. It is a really helpful companion to the video for sure. And I think one of the things that really struck me was how the teachings encourage us to question like those everyday assumptions we make about, just our experience of the world. Like, what do we take for granted? And when you start asking those simple questions, it can lead to some really deep insights.
Totally. And like one of the first things that kind of jumped out was this idea of like two kinds of realities. The transcript talks about realities that experience things and realities that are experienced. What's that all about? Can we unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. That's like a fundamental distinction. And it's kind of the foundation for a lot of what follows in the teachings. So basically what it's saying is there's a difference between like the act of experiencing, right? So your consciousness, the seeing, the hearing, the thinking, all of that, that's one kind of reality. And then there's the stuff that's being experienced. So the colors you see, the sounds, the thoughts even, the objects of your experience.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So one is like the process and the other is what's being processed.
Right, exactly. And the video gives a really helpful example. Like, you might look at a beautiful landscape and think, I'm seeing this amazing view. But if you break it down, what's really happening is your visual consciousness is experiencing a bunch of colors and shapes.
And then the transcript mentions how quickly our minds like jump in and add all this extra stuff. And it says, so quickly there's thinking about all the colors, the shapes, the ideas. So mostly there's life in the mind. Like we barely even register the raw sensation before our brains are off to the races making stories about it.
That's exactly right. It's like a super fast chain reaction. And that's where the study guide comes in handy because it clearly defines these two kinds of realities. It calls the moments of consciousness realities that experience and the objects and sensations themselves realities that are experienced, which is a pretty helpful way to put it.
It is, yeah. It makes it a lot clearer. But it also makes you realize, like, how much of our reality is actually just our minds interpreting things. It's like a constant commentary running in the background. Like, think about the last time you had a really strong reaction to something you saw. Was it really just the visual information that triggered that, or was it the whole story your mind spun around it?
That's such a good point. It's like we're constantly creating a narrative around these fleeting sensory experiences.
Totally. And that kind of leads us to another really central idea that comes up in both sources, the idea of no self. The video pretty much states outright that, in truth, no self, nothing to be found, because they're just these different realities that experience and those which are experienced.
Yeah.
That's a pretty bold statement, right? It's like it's challenging this fundamental idea of who we think we are.
It is a pretty radical shift in perspective for a lot of people. But it's really at the heart of how Buddhism views reality. So this concept of no self, or anatman in Pali, doesn't mean that we don't exist, obviously. What is challenging is our belief in this kind of permanent, independent I that's always there, owning all our experiences.
So it's not that we don't experience things, it's that there's not this fixed me that's having the experience.
Right. And the study guide explains that no self really means understanding that there isn't this solid, unchanging entity that's like in possession of all these fleeting moments of seeing, hearing, thinking, feeling, all of that. It's more like, everything is constantly changing, flowing, arising, and dissolving, kind of like waves in the ocean.
So it's not that there's no wave, it's just that the wave isn't this separate, independent thing. It's part of this larger, ever-changing body of water.
Exactly. And in the same way, what we think of as our self is actually a bunch of experiences that are constantly changing without this fixed core. And, that raises a really interesting question for you, the listener. If this idea of a solid self is actually an illusion, what does that mean for how we understand our lives, our problems, our relationships? Like, think about how much energy we spend on protecting and defending this idea of ourselves. If that self isn't actually real in this permanent way, What does that say about all the things we worry about, the conflicts we have?
That's a huge question. It really makes you rethink things. And it seems like the sources really emphasize the role of the mind in all of this. The video talks about how after you have sensory experience, like seeing a color, there's this super fast chain reaction of thoughts and interpretations and stories that pop up. It says, mostly there is life in the mind.
Yes, and the study guide also talks about how mental activity like thinking, planning, remembering, all of that, it actually makes up a bigger part of our experience than just the raw sensory input, which is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. Like, we're not just passively taking in information, we're actively shaping it with our minds.
So it's like the mental commentary is actually louder than the actual experience itself.
Exactly. So, it's a good question to ask yourself, how often are you reacting to things based purely on what you're seeing or hearing? And how often is it your interpretation that's driving your reaction?
I mean, honestly, probably way more often the interpretation than the actual thing.
Yeah.
And that brings us to something else the sources talk about, which is the importance of learning and understanding these fundamental truths. The video quotes Acharn Sujin saying, "Without hearing about the truths that the Buddha taught, there's no way for the ignorance to be overcome." That sounds pretty crucial, right? Like, just hearing about these ideas is the first step.
Absolutely. And the study guide says that understanding these realities doesn't happen overnight. It happens a little by considering them. So yeah, just being exposed to the ideas is essential. It's like trying to find your way through a new city without a map. You could wander around for hours and get nowhere. But if you have a map, you can actually start making progress. And this deep dive, what we're doing right now, you could think of it as like that first glance at the map.
So it's not about instantly knowing everything. It's about starting to explore, to think about these ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things we need to understand, according to the teachings, is the concept of ignorance. But they're not talking about ignorance like not being smart or something. It's a specific kind of ignorance.
What do they mean by ignorance then?
So in this context, ignorance means not understanding the true nature of reality, like not seeing the difference between those two kinds of realities, clinging to the idea of a permanent self, not getting that everything is impermanent. And the sources say that this misunderstanding is actually the root of a lot of our difficulties and suffering.
Which kind of leads to the whole idea of attachment being the cause of so much suffering. The video talks about how understanding the Buddha's teachings helps us see that connection between ignorance and attachment.
Exactly. And the study guide defines attachment as this strong emotional clinging to things, could be possessions, relationships, even our own identities. But because everything is constantly changing, if we're holding on too tightly, we're setting ourselves up for pain. Like, think about a time when you were really attached to a specific outcome and then things didn't go the way you wanted. How did that feel?
Yeah, it's like the more you try to control things, the more they slip away. It's like holding sand in your hand. The tighter you squeeze, the more it falls through your fingers.
It's a perfect analogy. And if we remember that there's no fixed self and that everything is impermanent, it makes sense that attachment would lead to suffering.
So what they're saying is, if we can start to loosen our grip on things, if we can accept that everything is in flux, it could actually lessen our suffering.
Exactly. And the invitation in these teachings is to really start paying attention to your own mind, to notice where you're clinging and how that might be contributing to your difficulties.
That makes a lot of sense. So just to recap, what we've been talking about is this idea that there are two kinds of realities: the act of experiencing and the things being experienced. We've explored the concept of no self, the idea that our sense of a permanent me is an illusion. We've talked about how our minds are constantly interpreting our experiences and how learning about these truths can help us overcome a fundamental misunderstanding of reality.
And ultimately, how that misunderstanding leads to attachment, which is seen as the root of so much suffering.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, but it's also incredibly profound. And it definitely leaves you with a lot to think about. Like, if we really start to see ourselves and the world in this way, if we understand that everything is impermanent and constantly changing, and that there's no fixed self at the center of it all, how could that change the way we approach life's challenges? It's definitely something to ponder.
Absolutely. It's a whole new way of looking at things.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
It has.
And until next time, keep those questions coming. We'll be here to explore them with you.
See you then.
Bye.
Bye.